Hi, my name is Andrew Evans, and in this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the history and some debates around the DSM definition of mental disorder. Here you see pictured a few versions of the DSM. This is the major manual for mental disorders for psychiatric conditions in the United States, and it's gone over several changes throughout the course of the years. So in this video, I'm going to focus on a few papers that have discussed what the DSM definition should be. The three papers I'm going to talk about in particular, the first is called Medical and Mental Disorder by Spitzer and Endicott from 1978. I'm also going to discuss a paper called Limits of Operationalization by Wakefield from 1993. And briefly at the end, I'm going to mention a paper called Harmful Dysfunction in the DSM Definition of Mental Disorder, which is also by Spitzer from 1999. All these are older papers. But I want to put them in context of a more contemporary DSM. So the DSM-5 isn't the newest DSM, but it came out in 2013, so it's pretty recent. And so I want to put these sort of debates in the context of the DSM-5's definition of mental disorder. Okay, so who are these people? This is Robert Spitzer and Jean Endicott. So they were involved in the creation of the DSM-3. And they wrote this paper in 1978 trying to give a definition of mental disorder. And the reason that it's an important paper is because that definition of mental disorder was adapted to become the DSM's definition of mental disorder. And, some changes have been made over the years, but a lot of the original thoughts that they had remain, right? As at least in the DSM-5's definition of mental disorder. So I'm going to discuss this paper first because it was kind of the impetus for the DSM's definition of mental disorder. And then I'm going to talk about Jerome Wakefield's paper because he responds and critiques the DSM definition of mental disorder. And specifically, he responds to Spitzer and Endicott's paper. Wakefield is a philosopher of mental health who has a very famous view of mental disorder that's a little bit different from the DSM view. So in this paper, we're sort of going to compare Wakefield's view to the view given by Spitzer and Endicott, compare Wakefield's view to the DSM definition of mental disorder. Okay, so this first paper in 1978. The paper begins by noting that the DSM-1 and the DSM-2 do not contain definitions of mental disorder, which is sort of strange. These authors, because they're part of creating the DSM-3, right, they're part of that process, they're arguing that there should include a definition of mental disorder. The DSM should define what mental disorder is since it's a manual of mental disorders. Now, I'm going to talk about their definition of mental disorder and how it relates to the DSM. But before that, I think it's important to talk about, what prompted this shift. Why did the American Psychiatric Association go from not having a definition of mental disorder to having one? And this is discussed a little bit in this paper. A big part of it was the activities of gay activists. At this time, we're talking about the 70s. The gay rights movement was coming to power. There was more and more acceptance of gay rights. And so what actually happened was so homosexuality unfortunately used to be in the DSM as a mental disorder. And obviously, people in the LGBTQ community pushed back against that. And this sort of protest came to a head in the 1970s. And they were really pushing back on this idea that homosexuality should be in the DSM. That prompted Spitzer, in particular, to rethink, whether or not this condition should be in the DSM. And that further prompted him and Endicott to start thinking about what is our definition of mental disorder, because we don't have one, right? There wasn't one in DSM-1 or DSM-2. So this is from the paper. Spitzer and Endicott say explicitly, quote, "The initial impetus grew out of the controversy as to whether or not homosexuality per se should be deleted from the psychiatric nomenclature." So here they're admitting that one of the inspirations they have to define mental disorder in the first place is to kind of correct this wrong, right? They're recognizing that homosexuality shouldn't be in the DSM, that it's not a mental disorder. And so that made them think, okay, well, how do we define mental disorder then? So there's a really interesting podcast from This American Life called 81 Words that you can find online. And it's about an hour long, and it gives a history of the changes around this time in the gay rights movement, and also how that impacted the American Psychiatric Association to remove homosexuality from the DSM. And Spitzer is discussed in this podcast. He was a part of this change. His views changed about homosexuality at this time. So it's a really interesting historical perspective on this really difficult topic, right? I mean, it was really problematic that homosexuality was in the DSM in the first place and that it was pathologized. And this podcast really goes over the history of how views changed and the DSM ultimately changed. And one of the major events that prompted that change was a gay psychiatrist. And he, at the time, was known as Dr. Anonymous. I think his name is John Fryer. I could be wrong. But this is him in this mask. He spoke at the American Psychiatric Association explaining that he's gay and that he's a psychiatrist, and he was pleading to get homosexuality removed from the DSM. So that was a major impetus for that change that ultimately led to the DSM defining mental disorder for the first time. All right, so moving on to their definition. What is the definition that Spitzer and Endicott came up with, and how does that end up relating to the DSM definition and the more recent DSM definitions that we have today? Okay, so this is my kind of condensed summary of the 4 criteria they give in their paper. So in this 1978 paper, Spitzer and Endicott say that a mental disorder should have these 4 criteria. The first is that the condition must cause harm in all environments. The second is that the variables relevant to the condition tend to be within the organism. The condition can't be easily resolved through gaining information or education or through non-technical means. So, what does that mean? Basically, they're saying that the condition has to be internal. It has to come from the organism itself, not from the outside. And also, it can't just be easily fixed, right? So they make this comparison of if if your foot is hurting, but it's hurting because it's trapped in a door, and all that needs to be done in order to get your foot to stop hurting is to open the door, then that's not really a disorder, right? It's just it's a non-technical solution, right? You don't need to go to the doctor in order to fix that. If your foot continues to hurt without the door, then that becomes a disorder and falls under the medical purview, right? So that's what they're trying to get at here, is it has to be in the organism and it can't be easily fixed. Criterion C says a condition is not a mental disorder if it is necessary to trade off for some other positive good. So there might be things that we're willing to suffer through in order for some other good, and they don't want to include that as a mental disorder. And they say that the last one is D, the conditions must be distinct from each other. So they're just saying that mental disorders have to be able to be distinguished from one another, right? And we have to know what the disorder is, right? And need to be able to distinguish the disorder itself from symptoms of the disorder. That's kind of what they're getting at with criterion D. Now, this is a complicated definition. I just want to highlight a few parts of it, but then I'm going to move on to the DSM-5 definition because that's more relevant to today. What they're really getting at here is that a mental disorder is harmful, right? They say that in criterion A. And it's internal, right, to the organism. They say that in criterion B. And that there's something going wrong, right? Saying that it can't be easily resolved indicates there's something going wrong, right? There's some dysfunction. And with C, saying that, it's not a necessary trade-off, they're also sort of indicated something's actually going wrong here, right? This isn't just a trade-off. So sometimes we suffer in order to get other good things. It's not like that, right? It's something actually going wrong inside the organism. So it seems to me the three things we can really pull out of this complicated definition is that the condition is internal to the organism, it is harmful, and there's some dysfunction, right? Something's going wrong. So here I'm ignoring criterion D because it sort of is a strange criterion to add, and we'll see Wakefield also ignores criterion D. He doesn't really think it makes sense for the definition. Okay, so as I mentioned, that's a complicated definition. It has a lot of parts. I don't want to focus as much on that specific one. I just want to note that it was influential in creating the DSM-3 definition of mental disorder. And there's been other DSMs throughout the course of the years, right? There's been changes. The DSM definition has changed over time. So what I want to do now is look at the DSM-5 definition of mental disorder, which is more contemporary. And it ultimately can trace its roots back to this 1978 paper, but it is a little different. So let's look at that. Okay, I'm going to read this quickly, and then I'm going to go through the different kind of important things to pull out of it. Quote, a mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotional regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. Mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in social, occupational, or other important activities. An expectable or culturally approved response to a common stressor or loss, such as the death of a loved one, is not a mental disorder. Socially deviant behavior, so political, religious, or sexual, and conflicts that are primarily between the individual and society are not mental disorders, unless the deviance or conflict results from a dysfunction in the individual as described above. Okay, another pretty complicated definition of mental disorder. So, what do I want to do here? I want to highlight what I think the important parts are and how it can be traced back to that 1978 definition that Spitzer and Endicott gave. So, here are some important parts. The first, it's clinically significant. So, this tends to mean like it is relevant to the clinic, right? A mental disorder has to be the sort of thing we want to treat, it has to be serious enough to be treated. The second two highlights that it's a dysfunction, an underlying mental functioning. That's really pointing to dysfunction, right? There's something going on in the individual that's a problem. Something's gone wrong. It also says that mental disorders are associated with distress or disability, usually. So that's like harm, right? They're not just dysfunctional, but they're also harmful. There's some sort of distress or disability associated with a mental disorder. So that actually gets you pretty much the whole definition. The rest of the definition is just excluding things, right? So two things that aren't mental disorders are expectable or culturally approved responses and socially deviant behavior. Okay. Now, this is what the DSM definition of mental disorder is for the DSM 5. We can disagree with this, right? This is by no means like the correct, quote unquote, definition of mental disorder, but it is that definition that shows up in the manual. So let's try to understand it a little bit more. Really, what it's getting at is that there is a harm and there is a dysfunction, right? It's indicating that it's a mental condition that is dysfunctional, and in some ways it is harmful. The dysfunction is noted here, and then the harm is put in terms of significant distress or disability. Okay. At its core, the DSM definition of mental disorder is saying that a condition is a mental disorder if it is a harmful mental dysfunction. That's how we can summarize it. So while we started with this complicated definition, we can summarize it as a harmful mental dysfunction. Okay? Just to keep things simple, that's how we'll think about the DSM definition. Okay, moving on to Wakefield. So Wakefield is talking mostly about this Spitzer and Endicott paper and earlier definitions of mental disorder that come from the DSM. He's writing in 1993, so he's writing 20 years before we have the DSM-5. So really he's talking about earlier definitions in this paper. He agrees with Spitzer and Endicott that mental disorder means harmful mental dysfunction. He thinks that's what their definition is really getting at, and he agrees. And the reason he agrees is because he has his own definition of mental disorder that came from this 1992 paper. And here's a quote from that paper. He says, quote, "I argue that a disorder is a harmful dysfunction wherein harm is a value term based on social norms and dysfunction is a scientific term referring to a failure of a mental mechanism to perform a natural function for which it was designed by evolution." So here, Wakefield says that a mental disorder, this is his own theory now, is a mental dysfunction, and dysfunction has to be put in terms of evolution, right? It's an evolutionary dysfunction, but it also must be harmful according to social norms. Now, I have a whole video explaining Wakefield's 1992 paper and his account of mental disorder. I definitely recommend checking that out because the rest of this video will make more sense in light of understanding Wakefield's argument in that paper, right? But this is it summarized in this quotation. He thinks that a mental disorder is a mental dysfunction, but dysfunction must be understood in terms of evolutionary design. And then on top of that, it's also harmful. Okay. Wakefield ultimately then disagrees with Spitzer and Endicott because of the way they think about dysfunction. So he has this evolutionary approach to dysfunction, and he doesn't think the way that Spitzer and Endicott are talking about dysfunction is correct. So here's a quote from him. He says, quote, "According to the dysfunction conception of disorder, to say that something has gone wrong in the person is to say simply that a mechanism inside the person is not doing what it was designed to do. However, because Spitzer and Endicott's operational approach did not allow for this direct functional construal, they had to find some other way to distinguish disorders from harmful internal conditions where nothing had gone wrong." So he's saying what we mean by dysfunction is that something isn't performing according to its design. But Spitzer and Endicott don't really define dysfunction. They sort of skirt around the issue, and he thinks that's a problem. So, in other words, Spitzer and Endicott say that mental disorder means harmful mental dysfunction, but they don't really define dysfunction. They don't really give us an account of what dysfunction is. And that's Wakefield's problem with this paper. So, we can kind of see this if we look back to the Spitzer and Endicott definition of mental disorder. Here, clearly they mention harm, right? So, they do think that these conditions are harmful. But they don't actually mention dysfunction, right? Instead, they kind of skirt around it by saying the condition is harmful in all environments. That sort of indicates a dysfunction, but it doesn't come out right and say it. Also, it can't be easily resolved, right, through information or non-technical methods. That sort of indicates a dysfunction too, but it doesn't come right out and say it. And the condition is not a mental disorder if it's necessary to trade it off for some other good. That sort of also indicates that something underlying is happening. Something has gone wrong in the individual. So Wakefield is basically saying, like, look, they are clearly thinking about mental disorder in terms of dysfunction, but they're not giving an account of dysfunction. What do they mean by dysfunction? And even though this definition of mental disorder from Spitzer and Endicott was 1978, this problem can be applied to the DSM definition from more recently in DSM-5. So even though Wakefield is critiquing this older version and he's talking about earlier versions of the DSM, we can apply his critique to the DSM-5 definition of mental disorder. So again, here is that definition. And what we're looking at in particular is dysfunction. What does the DSM 5 mean by dysfunction? They say that a mental disorder, at least in part, is a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental processes underlying mental functioning. What do they mean by that? Well, kind of like the Spitzer and Endicott definition, they never really say, but instead they say some things that aren't dysfunctional, right? An expectable or culturally approved response, like grief after death of a loved one. That's not a dysfunction. Socially deviant behavior, right? Conflicts that are primarily between individual and society. That's not a dysfunction. And it even says here, unless it is a dysfunction, right? And then it's a dysfunction, right? So the point that Wakefield is making is that in the very early version from Spitzer and Endicott, and we can even apply his critique to this DSM-5 definition, clearly they are saying that a mental disorder is dysfunctional, but they're just not really explaining what they mean by dysfunction. Instead, they sort of skirt around the issue and say some things that dysfunction is not. So Wakefield thinks that a better option would be if the DSM used his own theory of dysfunction. He says, quote, Spitzer and Endicott began with what I argue is close to correct view of disorder as harmful dysfunction. It is mainly in the process of operationally defining dysfunction that the problems with the definition were born. Its problems are caused by its divergence from the dysfunction requirement, in which dysfunction is interpreted specifically in evolutionary terms. These conclusions support my harmful dysfunction account of disorder. So, what is Wakefield saying here? He's saying if they used my version of what dysfunction means, then that would solve their problems. And he has a version of what dysfunction means, right? For Wakefield, a dysfunction is an evolutionary dysfunction. A mental mechanism isn't operating according to its evolutionary design. He thinks that the DSM should use that version of dysfunction in their own definition of mental disorder. So that's Wakefield's critique. He ultimately thinks that Spitzer and Endicott in the DSM are getting something right because they're talking about mental disorder in terms of a harmful mental dysfunction. But he thinks we really need to ground dysfunction in a definition itself. And we need to ground it in something scientific. We need to ground it in evolution, right? Evolutionary design. So just a reminder, this is Wakefield's approach. A mental disorder is harmful according to social norms and dysfunctional according to evolutionary norms, right? A failure of a mental mechanism to perform a natural function for which it was designed by evolution. Okay. And actually, Spitzer ends up changing his mind on this. In this 1999 paper called Harmful Dysfunction in the DSM Definition of Mental Disorder, he says that Wakefield was right and he was wrong. He says, quote, in my own attempts to define disorder, I recognize the essence of the concept of disorder is that something is not working in the organism. What I was never able to articulate was the nature of dysfunction, or to put more simply, what is not working. And he also says, quote, the harmful dysfunction analysis, which is Wakefield's, is a substantial advance over previous attempts to define disorder and specifying the nature of what is not working in the individual, the dysfunction. So here, Spitzer agrees with Wakefield. He thinks, yeah, I didn't ever really define dysfunction. In Spitzer and Endicott 1978, there isn't really a full definition of dysfunction. And he thinks that Wakefield gives us one in his 1999 paper, or I'm sorry, 1992 paper. As we're wrapping up here, I do want to note that Wakefield's definition of mental disorder has received a lot of criticism. So while Spitzer agrees with Wakefield, and Wakefield clearly thinks that his is right and thinks the DSM should use his definition, there's actually been a lot of criticism of Wakefield's definition, and specifically his requirement that dysfunction should mean evolutionary dysfunction. And here's a slide from an earlier video on Derek Bolton's book, What is Mental Disorder? I did a video on chapter 3 of that book where Bolton distinguishes between these two options. One, that Wakefield is correct, and two, that Wakefield is wrong. And this kind of serves as a criticism of Wakefield because in this option where Wakefield is correct, he kind of says that the term mental disorder isn't that clinically useful, right? Because Wakefield grounds mental disorder and dysfunction in evolutionary design, it's actually really hard from the clinic to decide if someone is evolutionarily dysfunctional or not, right? So I just want to kind of note that. I talk about this in much more detail in that video, but I want to note that Wakefield's view of mental disorder has been criticized, even though Spitzer does ultimately get on board later in life. Okay, so that was a lot of information. I want to end with just some questions to reflect on, like, what are the takeaways here? Why is it important to be talking about these things? First question. Well, is harmful mental dysfunction the best way to define mental disorder? So both Spitzer and Endicott on one hand, the DSM on the other hand, and Wakefield on the third hand, they all define mental disorder as harmful mental dysfunction. But is that correct? Um, if it is correct, is it better to leave dysfunction open to interpretation, like the DSM does, and to some extent, like Spitzer and Endicott do? Do we need to have a full definition of dysfunction? Or is it better to ground dysfunction in something? And does it matter what we ground dysfunction in? So for Wakefield, it has to be grounded in something scientific, and he grounds it in evolutionary design. For him, a dysfunction is a evolutionary dysfunction. And then we can ask, if the DSM did adopt Wakefield's definition of mental disorder rather than the one they have, what would change, right? What impact would that make? Because right now, the DSM does say that a mental disorder is a harmful dysfunction, but it doesn't really define dysfunction. What if it did specifically talk about evolutionary design? And that's something that Wakefield talks a bit about towards the end of his paper. What would change if the DSM switched to his view? And Spitzer in the 1999 paper also sort of talks about what would change if they switched to Wakefield's view. All right, finally, I just want to end with this. What do you think? Maybe pause the video and spend a few minutes thinking about this. Based on what was discussed in this video and your own experiences, what do you think is the correct definition of mental disorder? Do these thinkers have it close to correct, or are they way off, right? There's lots of other approaches to mental disorder that are much different than these. So we can wonder if these ones are correct, or if you think another definition of mental disorder would be better or is more accurate. All right, well, that is all I have for this video. Thank you for watching.